That bridge wasn't just made of wood, it was my freedom. And Angelina Dixon demolished it with her perfect, practiced smile. In most neighborhoods, disputes over backyard DIY projects end with awkward emails or maybe some forced apology muffins. But here in Willowbrook, even small disagreements blow up into epic battles involving sabotage, passive-aggressive signs, fines that feel like pyramid schemes, and secrets so filthy they make swamp water seem inviting. So if your bridge got turned into a modern art installation by a woman with a clipboard and a power complex, what would you do? Let me know in the comments below. Bonus points if your plan involves power tools, sarcasm, and at least one petty environmental crime. Let's rewind a bit. 6 months ago, I moved to Willowbrook Estates after my divorce, hoping to find some peace by the lake. This wasn't a swanky neighborhood, just decent houses clustered around an artificial lake built in the '90s. I paid $450,000 for a modest place with a backyard that sloped down to the water. As a water infrastructure engineer, I thought building a simple wooden bridge to a small dock would be the perfect weekend project. For 3 months, every Saturday morning, I worked on that bridge. Nothing fancy, pressure-treated lumber, hand-carved railings, and a gentle arch clearing the water by 4 feet. I stained it a warm honey color and made it my meditation spot, my sanctuary to watch the sun rise over the lake with a cup of coffee. That's when Angelina Dixon decided it was a problem. One Tuesday morning, I found a crisp white envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. It bore the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association letterhead, with Angelina's name as board president. The letter was politely worded but left no room for compromise. Dear Mr. Harper, it has come to our attention that you have constructed an unauthorized structure extending into Lake Serenity. This bridge constitutes a visual obstruction that detracts from the upscale aesthetic our community strives to maintain. Please remove it within 10 business days. It ended with a signature that probably cost more than my morning coffee. I wanted to handle this diplomatically, so I called and arranged to meet Angelina at her palatial $5 million mansion, complete with manicured gardens and a circular driveway that practically screamed, "I'm better than you." She was everything I expected: late 30s, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, designer clothes, and a smile that never reached her eyes. She invited me into a living room that looked like a high-end furniture showroom and offered me coffee from a machine that probably cost more than most people's cars. "Mr. Harper," she began, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "I'm sure you understand that Willowbrook Estates is an upscale community with certain standards. Your little construction project doesn't align with our aesthetic vision." I tried to explain that the bridge was well built, safe, and actually enhanced the natural beauty of the lake. I even offered to modify the design if she had concerns. But the more I spoke, the colder her expression grew. "This isn't negotiation," she finally snapped, her carefully crafted persona cracking. "This is an upscale community, not your backyard hobby workshop. The bridge goes, or you'll face escalating fines." 2 weeks later, I came home from work to find my bridge reduced to splinters floating in the lake. A demolition crew was packing up their gear while Angelina stood on her deck, arms crossed, watching the destruction like it was a show put on just for her. I slammed my car door and she had the nerve to wave at me, like nothing had happened. I stood there staring at what was left of 3 months' work, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest. That bridge wasn't just wood and nails. It was my sanctuary, my proof that I could still build something beautiful after my life fell apart. That night, I waded into the shallows and gathered every scrap of broken railing I could find. With leftover lumber from my garage, I built a simple sign that read, "This was mine," and planted it right where the bridge used to stand. I thought back to the last time my ex-wife visited. She'd stood on that bridge, her back to me, hands gripping the railing. In that moment, I'd thought, at least I've built something beautiful. After she left, that bridge was the only reason I got up early on Saturdays. Angelina hadn't just destroyed a bridge. She'd shattered what little hope I had left that I could start over again, leaving me there in the water, picking up the pieces of my hope. I realized this wasn't just about home rules or neighborhood aesthetics. It was about whether someone like me, broken, trying to rebuild it, deserved to find something good in the wreckage. The next morning, Matt Cooper showed up with a six-pack of beer and a story about how Angelina fined him $300 for the wrong color curtains in his window. "She's been pulling this crap for 2 years," he said, his face flushed with anger. "Last month she cited Mrs. Patterson for planting daffodils instead of tulips. Said it clashed with the neighborhood's color scheme." Even Clara Rhodes, who normally kept to herself, stopped by while I was reinforcing my sign. She glanced nervously at Angelina's mansion before whispering, "I've been keeping records of everything she does. That woman is drunk on power. Someone has to stop her." Monday morning brought another letter demanding I take down my unauthorized signage within 48 hours or face a $500 fine. I read it twice, then marched right over to Angelina's house and rang her doorbell. "You want to play games?" I said, meeting her gaze. "Let's play games. But don't blame me for how this ends." Exactly 48 hours later, the fine arrived at $3,000 for environmental contamination and unauthorized lake debris. They said my bridge splinters were polluting the pristine waters of Lake Serenity. The letter was full of legal jargon designed to intimidate. The letter was loaded with references to municipal codes and environmental regulations, sounding official and intimidating, but all nonsense. Angelina was clearly trying to bury me in red tape and scare me into submission. What she didn't know was that I'd spent years dealing with real environmental compliance. This was nothing but hot air. Instead of paying the absurd fine, I decided to rebuild something new from the rubble. Using salvaged wood and fresh hardware, I put together a bigger, bolder sign that made my message crystal clear. "My bridge lives." I planted it right where the old bridge had stood, reinforced with concrete so there was no chance it would budge, and it was perfectly positioned to be visible from Angelina's deck. Matt Cooper showed up while I was working on the sign, a wrench set in hand and the biggest grin I'd seen in weeks. "She's going to hate this," he said, pointing to Angelina's mansion where her silhouette could be seen pacing back and forth behind the curtains. "Good," I said, tightening the last bolt. "She hated my bridge too." Matt then dropped a bombshell. The previous month, Angelina had fined him $800 for curtains she claimed were aesthetically inappropriate. Apparently, the HOA had secretly approved a window treatment guideline listing acceptable colors and styles and no homeowner input required. The next evening, I saw just how far Angelina would go to keep her grip on the neighborhood. She sent an email to every resident with the ominous subject line, "Protecting our five-star lifestyle from rebels." It was a manipulative masterpiece, painting me as a dangerous troublemaker out to ruin property values and tarnish Willowbrook's carefully crafted image. Reading that email in my kitchen, my hands shook with anger. It was clear now, Angelina wasn't just controlling. She was a real threat, as someone willing to lie, manipulate, and destroy reputations to maintain her power. But there was one telling detail on her email. She was worried. She saw that my message was striking a chord with other residents. That night, I walked the lake's edge and noticed how some neighbors wouldn't meet my eyes. Others slipped quickly indoors as I passed. Angelina's poison pen was working, isolating me, cutting me off from potential allies. But isolation gave me time to think, and thinking led me to some important discoveries. I spent the next few days in the local planning office, digging through records on Lake Serenity and the development around it. What I found made my engineer's blood run cold. The lake's health depended entirely on a dam built in 1962 by Dixon Construction Company, Angelina's family business. The maintenance records were practically non-existent, with no major inspections recorded since the 1980s. Clara Rhodes turned out to be an unexpected ally. One evening, she approached me nervously, glancing around before handing me a manila envelope. "I found this in my late husband's papers," she whispered. "He was on the original HOA board. I think you should see it." Inside was a letter from 1994, written by her husband to the county health department. He'd raised concerns about the water quality in Lake Serenity and asked for regular testing. He mentioned odd discoloration and foul odors when the water was low. There was no record of any response. With this information in hand, I decided it was time to go public. I wrote an email back to the whole neighborhood in response to Angelina's smear campaign. But instead of defending myself, I asked questions. "Fellow residents, if we're also concerned about protecting property values, Shouldn't we also care about the condition of the dam that keeps our lake full? When was the last time it was inspected by a professional? I attached links to county records that showed the dam's age and spotty maintenance history. The reaction was immediate. Within hours, I got dozens of replies from neighbors I'd never spoken to before. Some thanked me for bringing up real issues. Others parroted Angelina's script, calling me a fearmonger. But the most fascinating replies came from longtime residents who remembered things I'm sure Angelina hoped they'd forgotten, as strange smells during droughts, fish die-offs in the early 2000s, and sudden drops in the lake level during hot summers. That weekend, I put up a second sign next to my bridge lives. This one read "Truth Over Rules," with a QR code linking to the public records I'd found. It was an open invitation for residents to see for themselves and decide what kind of community they wanted to live in. Monday morning, of course, brought another fine. This one was $5,000, claiming I was responsible for unauthorized signage. The new fine letter accused me of commercial signage and environmental fear-mongering. But what caught my eye was the shaky signature and the fact that Angelina had used her personal email instead of the HOA's official address. She was slipping, making the kind of mistakes people make when they feel their control slipping away. Then, the breakthrough came from an unexpected source: my old colleague Jake Morrison, who worked at the State Environmental Protection Agency. When I casually mentioned Lake Serenity during a call, his tone changed instantly. "Zane, please tell me you're not living on that lake," he said, and the concern in his voice made my stomach turn. Jake explained that Lake Serenity had been on the state's watch list for environmental concerns since the early 2000s, but political pressure and budget cuts had kept any real investigation at bay. He couldn't give me official documents, but he pointed me toward public records that would help me see the bigger picture. The next morning, I found an anonymous manila envelope in my mailbox. No postmark, no return address, just a thick stack of papers. My hands stuck to the dusty old paper as I tore it open. The first page looked like it had survived a fire: faded lines, smeared ink, and alarming ammonia levels spiking way beyond safe limits. The next page was even worse: a sketch of the dam with a single red circle and a shaky handwritten warning: "If this section cracks, the lake empties in 3 hours." Then came a stack of old home memos, every one signed by Angelina. They started off innocuous, but I noticed repeated instructions like, "Keep water levels high to hide bottom sediment. Don't alert residents. Avoid unnecessary panic." This wasn't management, it was a cover-up. One memo, dated just 6 months ago, was especially damning. "Continue current practices to maintain property values and prevent unnecessary panic." As I read through these documents, my phone buzzed with an anonymous text: "You're not the only one reading these. Be careful." I glanced around but saw no one. The sense of being watched was real, a chill down my spine that told me the conspiracy ran deeper than I'd imagined. The worst document was a 1996 engineering report, commissioned by the original HOA board when Claire's husband was still alive. It stated bluntly, the dam was unsafe, and repairs would have cost $200,000 back then. Even worse, it mentioned leftover contamination from a chemical plant that had dumped toxins upstream as solvents and heavy metals that should have been handled as hazardous waste but had settled in the lake bottom instead, waiting for the dam to fail. The report recommended regular water quality tests and containment barriers to keep the toxic sediment from reaching the main lake. In the margin, a note in shaky handwriting read, "Too expensive. Find cheaper alternatives." I flipped through page after page of technical data, each one more damning than the last, until I heard a soft knock at my door. Clara stood in the porch light, her face pale and her hands trembling as she handed me another manila envelope thicker than the first. "I can't sleep," she said, her eyes hollow with something more than just exhaustion. "I've been carrying this too long." When I asked how long she'd known, Clara's shoulders sagged. "That year, my husband cast the only vote to repair the dam. Angelina was just a child, but her grandfather, he said he'd handle it cheaper. My husband never forgave himself for not fighting harder. He spent the rest of his life documenting what they were hiding." Her voice cracked as she confessed, "I should have spoken up years ago, but I was afraid of lawsuits, of losing my home, of what people would think. But now I'm more afraid of what will happen if I stay silent." She told me how they'd painted over cracks, dumped chemicals to hide the smell, and kept the lake full so no one would see the rotting corpse beneath. "That's not maintenance," she said. "It's makeup on a corpse." What Clara revealed was a 30-year cover-up by the HOA, each board choosing to bury the truth instead of facing the financial and legal consequences. With this understanding, I reached out to Jennifer Walsh, an environmental reporter known for tackling stories like this. She was sharp, experienced, and instantly intrigued when I told her what I'd found. "Environmental cover-ups in wealthy communities happen all the time," she said, taking notes as I laid out everything. "The rich don't like to see problems that hurt property values, and local officials usually turn a blind eye." Jennifer agreed to investigate but warned me it wouldn't be quick or easy as she'd have to verify every document and every claim. "People like your HOA president don't go down quietly," she cautioned. "They get more desperate and more dangerous before they break." That evening, I added a new sign to my growing collection: "Beautiful lake, broken dam." I placed it at the entrance to the neighborhood where no one could miss it. The message was simple but impossible to ignore. The sign wasn't even up an hour before my phone started ringing. The first call was from Matt Cooper, laughing and congratulating me on really stirring the pot. The second was from a woman asking sharp questions about water quality and property insurance. The message was spreading. But the third call was from Angelina herself. The fury in her voice was like nothing I'd ever heard. "You have no idea what you're playing with," she hissed. "That lake represents $50 million in property values, and I will not let some bitter divorce loser destroy what generations of families have built. Remove that sign, stop spreading lies, and maybe I'll consider reducing your fines. Keep pushing, and I'll make sure you lose everything you have left." The call ended with a click that sounded like a gunshot. That night, I walked around the lake, noticing something new: 3 people standing on a deck, talking in hushed tones. When I got closer, they fell silent, avoiding my eyes. But just as I neared Matt Cooper's house, an elderly woman I'd never met waved me over. She leaned in and whispered, "They won't say it publicly, but a lot of people have noticed strange things about this lake for years. You're not crazy, they're just scared of the HOA." Her words hit me like a revelation. I wasn't as alone as Angelina wanted me to believe. Beneath the surface of forced smiles and neighborly small talk, there was a quiet current of doubt and whispered worries that had been buried by fear and social pressure for years. The community wasn't as united behind Angelina as she liked to portray. People were watching, questioning, and waiting for someone to finally speak the truth they all suspected. Later that night, I stood by the lake with a flashlight, examining the dam with new eyes. What I'd always seen as a picturesque stone wall now looked ominous and unstable, the cracks and trickling water telling a story no amount of cosmetic patchwork could hide. Even the water itself seemed more menacing, its dark, oily sheen no longer something I could blame on algae blooms. Now I knew better. The following morning brought urgency to everything. Jennifer Walsh called, her voice tinged with the excitement of a reporter on the trail of something big. She'd uncovered evidence that at least 3 times in the past, residents had tried to raise alarms about the lake's condition, each time quietly silenced by the HOA. Worse still, she found that the state environmental agency had twice tried to schedule inspections in the past 5 years, only to be blocked by the HOA's legal excuses. Angelina wasn't just covering things up, as she was actively obstructing the truth. That afternoon, I decided to take things into my own hands. I called Jake Morrison again and filed an official request for an emergency assessment of Lake Serenity. The state's response was swift and thorough, far more than Angelina could have expected. Within 48 hours, 2 environmental engineers showed up with equipment that looked like it belonged in a sci-fi lab. They spent 3 days collecting water and soil samples, measuring the dam's structural integrity, while Angelina prowled her deck like a caged predator, unable to stop them but visibly furious. On their final day, Dr. Catherine Morris, the lead investigator, stopped by my house with an unofficial update. "Mr. Harper," she said gravely, "I can't share the full report, but I can tell you this: the dam's condition is concerning, and the water quality poses significant risks. The community needs to know." That night, I realized the time for half measures was over. I was either going to vindicate everything I'd fought for or get buried under lawsuits for the rest of my life. But before I could act, the neighborhood itself began to stir in ways I hadn't expected. The next evening, I saw a group of neighbors gathered around the Pattersons' mailbox, their voices low and tense. Who gave her the authority to fine $300 for curtains? One man demanded, his frustration boiling over. Last year, she threatened me with legal action for planting jasmine instead of tulips, a woman said, her laugh brittle and hollow. The group's laughter quickly faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. No one dared mention the lake, but it was there in every nervous glance, every quick look toward Angelina's mansion. I watched from a distance as they drifted away, each one glancing back at the mansion before slipping home. Fear was still in the air, but so was a new kind of tension, one that might finally break the dam. By now, I'd learned enough about the dam's structure to understand how it worked and how it could be undone. The lake's water level was controlled by a manually operated spillway gate, which hadn't been opened in years, likely because exposing the contaminated sediments beneath would reveal everything they were trying to hide. Matt Cooper was the perfect ally, fed up with Angelina's petty tyranny and genuinely concerned about the environment. She fined me another $600 yesterday, he told me, showing the latest letter citing his mailbox as non-compliant. Apparently, Angelina had decided standard mailboxes weren't fancy enough for her curated aesthetic. Our plan was straightforward. Matt would create a distraction on the far side of the lake while I made my way to the spillway controls. His role was to fake a maintenance emergency with his boat engine, complete with smoke and panicked shouts that would draw Angelina's attention. We put our plan in motion on a dusky Wednesday evening, just as the sun slipped behind the hills. Matt's performance was nothing short of award-worthy. His boat engine belched black smoke as he yelled for help, his voice echoing across the lake. From her deck, Angelina watched with binoculars, fixated on the chaos across the water. It gave me the opening I needed. I slipped down to the dam, heart pounding, and reached the rusted control lever. The spillway controls weren't exactly high security, just an old, rusted padlock that my bolt cutters made short work of. The gate mechanism itself was ancient but functional. Within minutes, I had water steadily flowing downstream, enough to start a slow but steady drop in the lake's level over the next few days. At first, the changes were subtle. By Thursday morning, the lake had dropped by about 6 inches, barely enough for a casual observer to notice, but enough to start revealing the dark secrets that lay hidden beneath. The once pristine shoreline of smooth stones and sand was now marred by patches of dark, oily muck that reeked of industrial chemicals. Even more telling were the reactions of the longtime residents. I saw them standing on their docks, brows furrowed, peering at the water like they were seeing it for the first time. They knew something was wrong, even if they couldn't quite put it into words. Angelina's reaction was quick and exactly what I expected. By Thursday afternoon, every resident received an emergency email from the HOA, claiming that the lake's temporary water level fluctuations were due to seasonal runoff and recent rains. She assured everyone that this was routine, that everything would be back to normal in a few days. It was a clever bit of misdirection to calm the masses and buy herself time to scramble. But by Friday, that misdirection was starting to unravel. More and more residents were taking pictures and videos of the exposed shoreline, sharing them in hushed conversations that Angelina couldn't easily shut down. Mrs. Patterson even called me directly. "Do you know anything about that awful smell coming from the lake?" she asked, her voice uneasy. I told her she might want to call the environmental authorities. Her tone shifted immediately. "You know, my late husband always said something was off with this lake, but no one believed him. Maybe he was right all along." Over the weekend, the situation reached a tipping point. The water dropped far enough to reveal long-buried evidence of contamination as streaks of dark sediment, a sharp chemical stench that was impossible to ignore, and even bits of rusted metal poking up from the lake bed. The sight was damning. On Sunday evening, Angelina showed up at my door, and the woman standing there was a far cry from the self-assured HOA president who'd once torn down my bridge. Her hair was disheveled, makeup streaked, and there was tremor in her voice I never heard before. "You have no idea what you've done," she spat out, her hand trembling as she pointed back toward the lake. "Do you understand? This could ruin everything: a property values, insurance policies, the entire future of this neighborhood." But what struck me most was what she didn't say. As she didn't deny there were problems. She didn't pretend the contamination wasn't real. Monday morning brought confirmation that everything was finally coming to light. Jennifer Walsh called, her voice practically buzzing with excitement. "The paper's getting flooded with calls," she told me. "Residents are sending in photos, water test results, and documentation that the HOA's been covering this up for decades." This story is writing itself. But even as that wave of truth was building, Angelina wasn't about to let it sweep her away without a fight. At exactly 9 a.m. on Monday, she sent out an emergency alert to every resident. A live community crisis meeting was scheduled for that evening. The message was pure Angelina, dramatic, authoritative, calculated to make her look like the calm voice of reason in the middle of a storm. "Fellow residents," she intoned, "our beautiful community is under attack, an attack on our property values and our quality of life. Join me tonight as I reveal the truth behind the sabotage threatening our homes." Sabotage. She was pinning it all on me, and I knew she'd go to any length to spin that story. That evening, I watched her broadcast from her deck. She'd spared no expensive professional lighting, multiple cameras, and a slick presentation full of charts and official-sounding data. This wasn't just damage control, it was a full-blown media offensive. She started with technical jargon about seasonal water level changes and routine maintenance, enough to sound credible to anyone who hadn't seen the evidence for themselves. But then she shifted gears, her voice rising with righteous indignation. "This is sabotage," she declared. "A personal vendetta by someone who refuses to respect the rules that keep our community beautiful and safe." She went on, hammering home the idea that I was the villain. "Look at your property taxes, your insurance rate. So why would anyone deliberately damage the environmental features that make our neighborhood so special? The answer is simple: revenge." But as she spoke, I kept my eyes on the live chat streaming beneath her video. It was a stark contrast to her polished performance. While some residents still clung to her story, others were openly questioning her claims, demanding answers about the smell, the contamination, and how long she'd known. Mrs. Patterson's comment cut through everything else. "I've lived here for 15 years, and these problems existed long before Mr. Harper's bridge. My husband was talking about the smell back in 2012, and we were told to stop spreading rumors. The spillway controls were secured by nothing more than an old, rusted padlock, an easy target for my bolt cutters. The gate's mechanism was ancient but still worked, and within minutes I had water flowing downstream, setting in motion a slow decline in the lake's level that would continue over the next few days. The initial signs were subtle but clear. By Thursday morning, the water had dropped about 6 inches, barely enough to alarm anyone who wasn't looking closely, but enough to start revealing the secrets hidden beneath the surface. The once pristine shoreline of clean sand and pebbles was now marked by patches of dark, oily sediment that carried a stench of industrial chemicals. What caught my attention even more than the sight were the reactions of the longtime residents. I watched them gathering at the water's edge, puzzled and anxious as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. They knew something was different, even if they couldn't yet put it into words. Angelina's response was swift and predictable. By Thursday afternoon, every resident had received an official email from the HOA explaining that the lake was simply undergoing seasonal water level changes due to rainfall patterns and natural drainage. The message assured everyone that these fluctuations were normal and that everything would be back to normal in a few days. It was classic misdirection, enough to calm most people while she scrambled behind the scenes. But by Friday, that illusion was starting to crack. A few residents had started taking pictures and videos of the exposed shoreline, sharing them and raising questions that Angelina couldn't easily dismiss. Mrs. Patterson even called me directly, her voice tight with concern. "Do you know anything about that horrible smell coming from the lake?" she asked. I told her she should probably call the environmental authorities if she was worried. Her interest peaked immediately. "I've been wondering about that smell for years," she confided. "My late husband always said there was something wrong with this lake, but everyone told him he was just imagining things. That weekend finally brought the revelation I'd been hoping for. The water had dropped enough to expose large swaths of the shoreline, revealing the full extent of the contamination. The smell was unmistakable now, a harsh chemical tang that reminded me of old dry cleaning solvents mixed with oil. Even more damning were the visual signs: dark stains in the sediment, water streaked with discolored patches, and bits of rusted metal poking up from the lakebed like relics from a forgotten past. On Sunday evening, Angelina showed up at my door. Gone was the confident HOA president who'd once tried to destroy me. She looked like a different person entirely. Her hair was in disarray, her makeup smudged, and her voice had an edge of desperation I'd never heard from her. The breakthrough I'd been waiting for came over the weekend. The lake had dropped enough to uncover large swaths of contaminated shoreline. The smell was no longer something you could ignore, a pungent chemical odor that reminded me of dry cleaning fluid mixed with petroleum. Worse still were the visual signs: black stains in the sediment, discolored water, and bits of rusting metal emerging from places long submerged. Sunday evening brought Angelina herself to my door. She was almost unrecognizable from the polished, self-assured HOA president who'd tried to destroy my bridge just weeks earlier. Her hair was a mess, her makeup streaked, and her voice had a desperate edge I'd never heard before. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, her hand shaking as she gestured toward the lake. "This could ruin everything: property values, insurance, legal liability. You might have destroyed the lives of every family in this neighborhood." But what struck me wasn't what she said, it was what she didn't. Not once did she deny the contamination or claim the environmental issues were made up. Monday morning confirmed that my plan had worked even better than I dared hope. Jennifer Walsh from the newspaper called me, her voice bright with excitement. "We're getting dozens of calls from Willowbrook Estates residents about Lake Serenity," she said. "They're sending us photos, state environmental test results, and HOA cover-up documents going back 30 years. This story is practically writing itself." That same morning, it became obvious that Angelina wouldn't go down without a fight. She'd spent the weekend plotting her counterattack, and at exactly 9 a.m., every resident received an emergency notification about a community crisis live stream happening that evening. The message had all the hallmarks of Angelina's style: dramatic, authoritative, and designed to frame her as the calm, capable leader confronting a crisis created by others. "Fellow residents," she wrote, "our beautiful community is under attack, an attack on our property values and way of life. Join me tonight as I reveal the truth about the sabotage that threatens our homes." She was setting up to pin it all on me. That evening, her live stream was an elaborate production: professional lighting, multiple camera angles, and what looked like a full presentation with charts and graphs. It was clear she was going all in. She even had a videographer on hand, suggesting this wasn't damage control but a carefully orchestrated media push to seize control of the story. She opened with a detailed explanation of the lake's so-called seasonal variations and routine maintenance issues, peppering her speech with enough technical jargon to sound almost convincing. But then she turned to the real purpose of her message: blame. "Ladies and gentlemen," she declared, her voice filled with righteous anger, "look at your property taxes, your insurance premiums, your home values. Ask yourself why would anyone deliberately damage the very features that make our community so valuable? The answer is simple: revenge. Revenge by someone who refuses to accept that communities have standards and rules." But while she was weaving her narrative, the live chat was telling another story entirely. Some residents clearly bought what she was selling. Others, though, were asking blunt questions about the smell, the water quality, and how long the problems had really been there. And then came Mrs. Patterson's comment, which cut right through the performance. "I've lived here 15 years, she wrote. "These problems existed long before Mr. Harper built his bridge. My late husband noticed the smell back in 2012, and we were told to stop spreading rumors." Residents began to share their own accounts of the contamination, sparking a real-time fact-checking session that Angelina couldn't control or censor. By Tuesday morning, environmental engineers were back at this time with a full investigation team and equipment that hinted at serious federal involvement. Dr. Morris stopped by my house again, his expression grave. "Mr. Harper," he said quietly, What we're dealing with here may be much worse than we initially suspected. The contamination extends beyond the lake and has likely seeped into the groundwater system. We're talking about potential health effects for thousands of people over decades. Wednesday brought the story I'd both hoped for and feared. Jennifer Walsh's article ran on the front page of the regional paper under the headline, "Decades of Environmental Cover-Up Exposed at Luxury Lake Community." The piece was meticulous and devastating. She'd tracked down former HOA board members, reviewed 30 years of maintenance records, and drawn clear connections between the original contamination, half-hearted cleanup efforts, and the decades-long cover-up by multiple board administrations. Angelina was featured prominently not only as the current president who continued the deception, but as the granddaughter of the contractor who had caused the original contamination and never fixed it. The fallout was instant and visible right from my kitchen window. Television news trucks began to arrive by noon, reporters interviewing stunned residents whose emotions ranged from fear to fury. Thursday brought Angelina's second live stream, and this time, her polished composure was gone. She looked disheveled, defensive, and increasingly frantic as she tried to shift blame away from herself. This crisis has been exaggerated by environmental extremists and by a vengeful individual intent on destroying our community, she said, her voice cracking. The so-called contamination is minor, manageable, and poses no immediate threat to anyone. The real threat is the panic and property damage caused by irresponsible reporting. But the real turning point came when Clara Rhodes called into the live stream, her voice calm and resolute as she challenged everything Angelina was saying. "I have documents proving this hoe has known about these problems for over 20 years, Clara said, ignoring Angelina's attempts to cut her off. "My late husband tried to push for real repairs in the 1990s, but the board led by Harold Dixon, Angelina's grandfather, voted him down." By Friday morning, the last piece of the puzzle landed in my mailbox. An anonymous envelope contained photocopies of insurance claims dating back to 2008, claims that had been quietly settled without any investigation. The documents painted a damning picture: systematic efforts to cover up the damage, unexplained water damage in basements, expensive soil replacement for poisoned landscaping, and even confidential veterinary settlements for pets made sick by the lake's contamination. The HOA hadn't just ignored the environmental crises, they had been actively paying to hide its effects. That afternoon, I made a choice that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I went down to the spillway controls and fully opened the gate, allowing the lake to drain at its maximum rate. Within hours, the water level fell dramatically, exposing decades of contamination, buried debris, and industrial waste that no amount of HOA spin could ever hide. By Sunday morning, the sight was both shocking and undeniable. Lake Serenity had become an exposed wasteland, like an archaeological dig site from some environmental hell. Rusted metal drums and corroded pipes jutted from the mud, clear evidence of industrial dumping, and the rainbow-slicked sediment reeked of petroleum and chemical solvents. There was even a hint of formaldehyde in the air, a smell that turned my stomach. The visual impact was gut-wrenching, but it was the human drama around the exposed lake bed that made it truly unforgettable. Families gathered along the shoreline, taking pictures and videos, their faces a mix of horror and outrage. Children pointed at the rusting debris and asked questions their parents couldn't answer. The media swarmed the site. By noon, crews from 3 TV stations, 2 radio stations, and 4 newspapers were there, turning the lake into the top story. They captured everything: wealthy homeowners living above a hidden environmental disaster, and HOA that had covered it up for decades, and a whistleblower determined to force the truth into the open. Residents began sharing similar stories, turning the situation into a real-time fact-checking session that Angelina had no way to control or delete. By Tuesday morning, environmental engineers returned, at this time with a full investigative team and equipment that signaled serious federal interest. Dr. Morris visited my home again that day, and his warning sent a chill through my bones. "Mr. Harper," he said gravely, "this is potentially far worse than we first thought. The contamination isn't confined to the lake, it's reached the groundwater system. We're talking about possible health effects for thousands of people over decades." Wednesday arrived with the article I'd been both waiting for and dreading. Jennifer Walsh's story was splashed across the front page of the regional newspaper under the headline, Decades of environmental cover-up exposed at luxury lake community. It was a thorough, meticulously researched piece with devastating implications. Jennifer had tracked down former HOA board members, combed through 30 years of maintenance records, and laid out the connections between the original contamination, the half-hearted cleanup, and the ongoing cover-up that had continued through different administrations. Angelina featured prominently in the PCO both as the current president who had perpetuated the deceit and as the granddaughter of the contractor who had caused the contamination in the first place. The article's impact was immediate and visible from my kitchen window. By noon, news trucks crowded the streets, and reporters interviewed residents whose faces showed a mixture of shock, anger, and fear. On Thursday, Angelina tried to push back. She hosted her second live stream, but this time the calm, polished persona was gone. She looked worn out, defensive, and more desperate by the minute, pointing fingers everywhere but at herself. This situation has been deliberately exaggerated by environmental extremists and by one vindictive person who wants to ruin our community, she said, her voice trembling. The so-called contamination is minor, manageable, and poses no immediate threat. The real threat is the panic and property damage caused by irresponsible reporting. But the real turning point came when Clara Rhodes called into the live stream. Her voice was steady and strong as she cut through Angelina's excuses. I have documents that prove this HOA has known about serious environmental problems for over 20 years, Clara declared, ignoring Angelina's attempts to talk over her. My late husband tried to fix this back in the 1990s, but the board led by Harold Dixon, Angelina's grandfather, voted him down. By Friday morning, the final piece of the puzzle appeared in my mailbox. An anonymous envelope contained photocopies of insurance claims dating back to 2008, all quietly settled without investigation. These claims revealed the extent of the cover-up: unexplained water damage in basements near the lake, expensive soil replacement for landscaping poisoned by chemicals, and even confidential veterinary payments for pets harmed by the contamination. The HOA hadn't just ignored the environmental problems, so they had paid to hide the evidence of the damage. That afternoon, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I walked to the spillway controls and fully opened the gate, allowing the lake to drain at its fastest possible rate. Within hours, the water level plunged, exposing decades of buried contamination, debris, and industrial waste that no amount of denial could ever hide again. By Sunday morning, the scene was beyond anything I could have imagined. With the gate open for 36 hours, Lake Serenity had turned from a beautiful water feature into something out of an environmental nightmare. The exposed lakebed looked like an archaeological dig site gone horribly wrong. Rusted metal barrels and broken pipes lay scattered across the mud, evidence of years of industrial dumping. The sediment was so saturated with chemicals that it shimmered with unnatural rainbow colors. The smell was overwhelming, a pungent mix of petroleum, solvents, and something that reminded me of formaldehyde. The visual impact was shocking, but the human response was even more powerful. Families gathered along the muddy shoreline, taking photos and videos, their faces a blend of horrified wonder and justified fury. Children pointed at the exposed debris, asking questions their parents couldn't answer. The media response was swift and relentless. By noon, crews from 3 TV stations, 2 radio stations, and 4 newspapers were on site, turning the exposed lakebed into the top story. They captured it all: wealthy homeowners who had unknowingly lived atop a hidden environmental disaster, and HOA that had covered it up for decades, and a determined whistleblower who refused to let the truth stay buried. They literally drained the lake to reveal the hidden truth. One television reporter stood before the exposed contamination and declared, "This is what 30 years of environmental cover-up looks like when the truth finally comes to light." Dr. Morris and her team returned in full hazmat suits, collecting samples from the uncovered sediments. Their early findings were horrifying: heavy metals exceeding EPA safety limits by tenfold or more, organic solvents that posed severe health risks through skin contact and inhalation, and industrial waste that should have been disposed of properly decades ago. Monday unleashed the legal storm I had both anticipated and feared. Class action attorneys descended like sharks, sensing blood in the water, setting up temporary offices in the community center, and offering to represent residents in lawsuits targeting every area from the original developers to the current HOA board. Environmental lawyers launched probes into potential federal violations that could lead to criminal charges. Insurance investigators began emergency assessments to determine coverage responsibilities for contamination that had been deliberately hidden. Our quiet suburban neighborhood was transformed into a legal battlefield, with multiple parties vying for claims and liabilities that could total hundreds of millions. But the most dramatic moment came during Angelina's complete meltdown on what turned out to be her final live stream. Disheveled and visibly drained, she made desperate, erratic attempts to control a narrative that had entirely slipped from her grasp. This contamination is the result of recent illegal dumping by environmental terrorists, she declared, her voice cracking under pressure. Zane Harper and his accomplices have deliberately poisoned our lake to push their radical agenda. The turning point arrived when Matt Cooper called in, calmly dismantling Angelina's last shred of credibility. "I've lived here for 8 years," he said steadily. "I have photos from 2015 showing discoloration and debris in spots now exposed. I also had documentation of strange odors and water quality complaints residents have made for years. This contamination didn't just appear last week, it's been here all along, and certain people have worked hard to keep it buried." His evidence was undeniable, sparking a flood of live comments from other residents sharing similar stories and proof. Tuesday brought a revelation that changed everything. Federal investigators arrived with a search warrant for HOA records dating back to the community's founding. They spent the entire day in the HOA office, hauling out box after box of documents, while Angelina stood nearby helpless and clearly grasping that her carefully built facade was crumbling. That evening, the confrontation I had anticipated since this nightmare began finally came. Angelina appeared at my front door not as the polished HOA president, but as a desperate woman watching everything she had worked to build unravel. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, voice a mix of rage and desperation. "This community represents $50 million in property value, hundreds of families trusting the HOA to protect their investments, and a lifestyle people spend their entire lives striving for. You destroyed all of that just to satisfy your petty grudge over a stupid wooden bridge." I looked at this once powerful woman and realized she never understood what this fight was truly about. "Angelina," I said quietly, "this was never about revenge. It was about truth. You destroyed my bridge because it challenged your authority. But the bridge was just wood and nails. What you destroyed was the trust between this community and its leadership of the health and safety of families who deserved to know what they were living with." Wednesday brought the news that effectively ended Angelina's reign and validated everything I had fought for. The federal investigation uncovered proof of systematic environmental crimes spanning 30 years. With documented evidence that multiple HOA boards had known about dangerous contamination and actively concealed it. The evidence included insurance settlements related to health problems caused by the contamination, payments to consultants for damage control instead of cleanup, and communications between HOA leaders and local officials suggesting a coordinated effort to block proper investigation and remediation. The final blow came when the state environmental agency released a preliminary report declaring Lake Serenity an immediate and serious health hazard. The entire area was officially labeled a contaminated site requiring emergency cleanup. Property values didn't just drop, they vanished entirely, as no bank would issue mortgages and no insurer would provide policies in a declared contamination zone. The weeks following Angelina's collapse unleashed a cascade of consequences that transformed Willowbrook Estates in ways no one could have foreseen. Federal environmental teams launched a massive soil remediation effort, turning the former lakebed into a bustling construction zone with heavy machinery working around the clock. Property insurers began the complex process of assessing coverage for decades of hidden environmental damage. Most dramatically, a federal grand jury convened to investigate possible criminal charges against current and former HOA board members, including conspiracy to violate environmental laws and fraud related to property value misrepresentation. Angelina vanished from public view, reportedly consulting with criminal defense lawyers while facing potential bankruptcy from a growing pile of civil lawsuits. Her $5 million mansion and every other home in the community was effectively worthless until the costly cleanup, estimated to take 3 to 5 years and exceed $60 million, was complete. But not all that emerged from the crisis was bleak. The community, once divided by Angelina's authoritarian grip, began coming together in unexpected ways, united by shared challenges and a common. The community's goal became clear: to rebuild something stronger and more honest from the ruins of what they had lost. Neighbors who had barely exchanged words before were now collaborating, coordinating legal strategies, pooling resources, and supporting one another through the daunting process of managing contaminated properties and uncertain futures. Clara Rodis emerged as an unexpected leader in this new chapter. Her bravery in preserving and exposing critical documents earned her the respect and trust that Angelina had demanded but never truly gained. Meanwhile, Matt Cooper proved invaluable in the recovery effort, using his mechanical skills to help residents handle the practical challenges of living in a contamination zone. The legal resolution arrived sooner than anyone anticipated, driven by the overwhelming evidence and federal prosecutors' desire to send a strong message about environmental crimes in affluent communities. Angelina ultimately pled guilty to federal charges of conspiracy to violate environmental protection laws and fraud for concealing contamination, receiving an 18-month federal prison sentence along with a $5 million personal restitution order. 3 former HOA board members were also convicted, albeit with lighter sentences in exchange for their cooperation in the ongoing investigation. The crisis's most dramatic moment came 3 days before Angelina's scheduled sentencing. She was arrested trying to sabotage the spillway controls I had used to drain the lake. Security cameras caught her wielding a sledgehammer, attempting to damage the gate mechanism, apparently hoping to flood the area again and hide the contamination. Matt Cooper, who happened to be walking his dog nearby, was the one who called 911, likely preventing a disaster that could have flooded multiple downstream neighborhoods. She was completely out of control, he told investigators, recalling how she screamed about fixing everything and exposing the truth. It was clear she had lost touch with reality. This act of attempted sabotage led to additional federal charges, ensuring Angelina's final public act was one of desperate destruction rather than dignified surrender. 6 months after the lake was drained, I stood where my wooden bridge had once connected my yard to the water. Now, I looked out over a carefully managed environmental cleanup site. The contaminated sediments were being professionally removed and treated. Advanced remediation techniques were restoring the underlying soil. Environmental engineers were designing a new, safe, sustainable, and well-monitored water system. The new bridge I had built to replace the one Angelina destroyed was smaller and simpler but served the same purpose, linking my property to something larger and more enduring than the artificial beauty once crafted through deceit. Several neighbors asked me to help design similar structures for their homes, and I found genuine satisfaction in creating something useful and honest instead of fighting battles over power and control. That evening, I sat on my new bridge, smaller, simpler, but truly mine. Matt settled beside me, opening a beer. Clara appeared with ginger cookies, setting them down silently. None of us mentioned Angelina, none of us needed to. We simply sat, listening to the distant hum of heavy machinery working in the cleanup zone. I realized then that what I had built wasn't just a wooden bridge, it was a real community, founded on truth rather than lies. The most unexpected development came 8 months after the crisis began. I received a letter from another HOA in a different state, where residents faced similar problems of authoritarian leadership and potential environmental cover-ups. They'd learned about Willowbrook Estates through national news coverage and sought advice on investigating and confronting their own community's issues. Your courage and willingness to stand against injustice has inspired people across the country, the letter read. Would you be willing to share your experience and help other communities avoid the mistakes that led to your crisis? That evening, sitting on my new bridge and watching the sunset over the remediation site that would one day be a properly maintained lake, I understood that the fight for justice never truly ends. It simply moves to new places, where people need the courage to choose truth over convenience. Angelina Dixon had shown me that unchecked power inevitably becomes destructive. But the community's response proved that ordinary people, armed with truth and genuine leadership, can choose justice over self-interest. The final chapter of the Willowbrook Estates story is still unfolding as environmental cleanup continues and families slowly rebuild their lives and their community. Property values may never fully recover, and some residents may never fully trust community leadership again. But something far more valuable has emerged, a neighborhood that values honesty, supports its most vulnerable members, and understands that true strength comes from shared commitment to truth and justice and not from clinging to profitable illusions. As I finished reading the letter from another struggling community, I looked out over the muddy construction site and smiled. Angelina destroyed my bridge because it symbolized independence and resistance to her control, but she had inadvertently taught me this: some bridges are worth building again and again, no matter how many times those in power try to tear them down.